Europe, the old continent. Its destiny is slowly coming to an end.
In the 21st century, Europe has been plagued by migration crises, protests, strikes, violence. Immorality.
Thursday evening, just up oil. Invader.
Weak leadership.
But the invaded.
Economic crisis and terrorist attacks. These scourges have led to the rise of the far right in every country.
I am European, and I am proud. I am proud of our unparalleled history, culture, and diversity. I am proud of what we have achieved as a civilization. But Europe as we know it, in all its richness and greatness, is under threat by a false representation.
Once again, people talked about the second coming of Jesus, the restoration of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Byzantine Empire or the British Empire. It was only a matter of time before a leader would emerge who would take advantage of these demands to unite the far right. 2032, England. A great leader like Napoleon and Hitler appeared in the north. He was Maebus. He proclaimed himself the Messiah who would make Europe and Christian civilization great again. He set his mind on restoring the British Empire. The British Army was the second strongest and largest army in NATO after the United States. However, after Republican America moved away from Europe and NATO broke up, the British became the strongest in the region. However, the country was in dire economic straits, which Maebus very quickly resolved and Britain rose again. He developed the army at a huge pace to achieve his dreams. Meanwhile, England began to expel and persecute its Muslim population. Such ethnic and religious persecution had not been seen in Europe since the Holocaust. By 2036, most countries in Europe had far-right leaderships allied with the British. The new form of the United European Army and the European Union was born, ready to dominate the world again. Maebus initially set his sights on conquering the Islamic world because he thought it would be easy. In August 2038, British and Greek troops invaded Turkey without a declaration of war. The Turks quickly collapsed and surrendered. Maebus gave Istanbul and Izmir back to the Greeks, then renamed Istanbul Constantinople, and Turkey became a puppet state of the British Empire. The Muslims could not let this go unanswered, and the two great enemies Saudi Arabia and Iran formed an alliance. Soon the Levant and the Holy Land fell to the British as the Jews sided with the British. The Jews celebrated Maebus as a messiah because he ordered the construction of a great Judeo-Christian temple in Jerusalem after the Palestinians were expelled. According to the Jewish scriptures, the temple will be rebuilt by the Savior. Maebus then easily conquered North Africa and Egypt, and went as far as Ethiopia and the Congo. With these conquests began the biggest and bloodiest war in world history, the Third World War, also known as the Final War. After that, England's all allies joined the war against Arabia and Iran. They were Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, Japan, South Korea, and all of Europe. In the Middle East and Africa, a permanent war developed over time, as the entire Arab and Persian people became enemies of the European army. A guerrilla war broke out, and neither side could make any headway. The Muslims fought valiantly despite facing the most powerful army in history. The British invasion of the Middle East lasted until 2040. Then British attention turned elsewhere, as this time the storm clouds gathered in Asia. In 2040, after India had defeated Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh, the Bharatists were close to create Bharat. However, they needed Tibet, which was part of China, and so they attacked China. This was a big mistake as they dragged China, North Korea, and Russia into the war. At the same time, Japan attacked China and Maebus started the Great Campaign against Russia. In 2040, the war has reached a level it should never have reached. Total destruction, mindless killing, and bloodshed. In the summer, the Great Campaign in Russia was launched, which was a stunning success for the Europeans. In just 2 months, Kiev, Minsk, Kharkiv, Smolensk, and St. Petersburg fell. The United European Army quickly reached Moscow, where it met unexpected resistance. The capital almost fell, but held out thanks to the heroic fight of the Russians. With the front at a stalemate, Mabus devised a plan to break through the Russians south at Voronezh in eastern Ukraine. The whole war depended on this town. If the British took Voronezh, they could encircle Moscow. The Russians had the whole east to help them, sending troops from Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Iran, Mongolia, and China. The great Eastern hero Ron was also in the battle. Ron was a Hungarian leader who preferred to fight on the Russian side. Soldiers admired him for his clairvoyance and his prediction that the war would end with the fall of the Europeans and the rise of the Easterners. Mabus himself was present at the battle, which was a battle between two colossal leaders and two mighty nations. The final assault was led by Ron himself, holding a red flag. Easterners destroyed the main European army. The retreating British, trying to hide in the suburbs, were nuked. It was the bloodiest battle of the war and of history. 22 million people died at Voronezh, but the city was eventually defended. After that, Moscow liberated. The capital was under siege for a year. The victory over British forces at Voronezh was the first victory against Mabus in the war. This broke the myth of Mabus's invincibility and strengthened the Russian army. By the summer of 2042, the Russian army was ready for revenge. "Go to Europe," said Ron. Mabus feared that America would invade Greenland and Iceland while European armies fought in other parts of the world. So Mabus acted first and, with the help of Canada, invaded the United States. The US government was surprised by the attack and the East Coast fell quickly. Mabus has already used nuclear weapons, which has completely destroyed New York and Washington. Taking advantage of this, Mexico attacked the US from behind and quickly advanced along the West Coast. However, the Americans were stubbornly held San Francisco and the southern states, so Mabus devised a plan to cut the US Army in two at Denver. The Battle of Denver was as important as the Battle of Voronezh. In the end, the Americans, thanks to their great courage and heroism, won the day and stopped the British and Mexican troops. Moreover, the Americans gradually liberated their previously fallen cities. Eventually, Mabus realized he had made a mistake and could not win on so many fronts at once, so he withdrew. The Americans then conquered Canada and Mexico. Like the Russians, the Americans lost tens of millions of men, but they became stronger than the British. By 2044, the Great War was raging on every continent in Asia, the Americas, Africa, Australia, and Europe. Heroic soldiers fought on land and sea, in the air and even in space. Mabus' army collapsed, and from then on they just retreated. Australia, Canada, Japan, and Korea fell. By 2045, European armies had been driven out of Africa and the Middle East. By then, Europe was besieged from all directions by three superpowers, the Islamic Caliphate, America, and the Eurasian Union. The Eastern nations were united by Ron and the Islamic world by Ahmad from Iran. This two-leader led the greatest campaign in history to conquer Europe. By this time, they referred to themselves as Jesus and Mahdi, born into this world to defeat the evil, called the Antichrist in Christian tradition and Dajjal in Islam. The soldiers and the people of the world believed in them, since Islamic tradition also tells us that Mahdi and Jesus would fight against the evil together. Now this war had biblical and mythological dimensions. It was also referred as the Armageddon. After the conquest of France, the Russians dropped a Tsar Bomba into the North Sea, only to have the resulting waves and flooding wash away the British coastal defenses in England. Their calculation worked and the operation was a great success. The largest and most multinational army in history could now cross the English Channel and head for England. At last, it seems, this terrible war is entering its final phase. Mavis attempted one last major breakthrough on the historic Hastings field. He used all his remaining tanks in the battle, the largest tank battle in history. The two sides had 25,000 tanks in total. But Mavis lost this battle and all of his good forces destroyed. After Mavis's last attempt, the Russians moved towards London. The final act of the bloodiest and last war in history, the last great battle, the Siege of London, began. The Siege of London was a bitter battle. The people were terrified of being attacked by Eastern and Muslim soldiers, who they called barbarians. They knew that the victors would take bloody revenge on them. London held out for only 2 weeks, its defenses washed away by the overwhelming numbers. But Mavis could not be found and fled to the mountains of Scotland. There, he devised a diabolical plan to destroy the world with his remaining nuclear weapons rather than be defeated, which would have resulted in total nuclear annihilation, destroying everything on the planet. But this operation failed, because the US Air Force destroyed the British missile stockpiles in Ireland in time. This resulted in the biggest explosion in history, made Ireland uninhabitable to this day. After his last plan had failed and the Russians were already in nearby of his hideout, he was committed suicide. But the war didn't end there because India was still fighting against China and Iran. But after Mavis's death, the Iranians used all their power against India and dropped atomic bombs on all major Indian cities and the Pakistanis occupied the country. The bombing of India killed 400 million people. That was the end of the Third World War. The war lasted 8 years, tens of thousands of cities were destroyed and nearly 2 billion people died. As the Allied armies liberated the occupied territories and conquered Europe, the genocide against Muslims was revealed, causing the deaths of 250 million people. Such brutal genocide has never been seen in the past. This war forever set an example of how terrible war is, so Ron created a world government that treats all nations and all religions equally. But the leaders of the great powers feared Ron's growing power, so they turned the people against him and the Eastern leader executed him. Nevertheless, Ron set the world on the path to ultimate globalization. A new world was born, where there would be no more war, suffering and famine.